Okay, thanks, Bob. This virtual world is certainly interesting. Uh, but I'm getting used to it because I've done the chapters in Birmingham, Alabama, and in Sacramento, California, and this is my third one. So we're getting the kinks worked out. So okay, so what I wanted to talk about today is this question: what is the optimum level of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere? And that's a question that I've never heard, which absolutely amazes me that I've never heard that question asked. Well, let's see if I can get my guy to change here. There we go. Okay, so I actually sent a message to this Climate Change Advisory Committee for the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And, you know, what I wrote them was basically what motivates me as an energy professional, along with a paycheck, is human flourishing. You know, our industry provides the energy that leads to huge improvements in both human longevity and quality of life. That, in my mind, is very similar to the metric of net present value or investment efficiency in project economics. The projects we as SPE, Society of Petroleum Engineers, members work on do have optimums. So we work hard to optimize NPV or IE depending on what metrics our company uses. I have never heard the question asked, what is the optimum level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? It amazes me that nobody in government, academia, or politics appears to be asking this obvious question. And after reading this, the guys invited me to join this Climate Change Advisory Committee. They obviously liked a little broader perspective maybe than what they've been looking at. So I'm going to good stewardship of the world God gave us. And, you know, we want to optimize our stewardship of planet Earth. And optimization requires an understanding of all the important aspects of a system. And the best example of optimization I can think of is a laptop computer. And, you know, I'd love to have a laptop with a 36-inch screen, but it's so big now I can't get it in my backpack. And it'd be nice if it was as portable as my cell phone, but I can't read it and I can't type on a keyboard. And it would be nice if I had a laptop where I didn't have to keep it plugged in. I could let the battery go for a week, but the thing then is so heavy I can barely pick it up. So you have to optimize all things that have, there's pros and cons, costs and benefits, and you try to get something that's an optimum of all of these features. So that's what optimization is all about, and engineers are trained to be optimizers. Now, so we're going to talk about climate change during this presentation, and I'm going to look at three questions. Is it real? Is it good or bad? And how much change has there been? And then I'm going to take a look at something that you don't hear hardly at all when people are talking about climate change, and that is feeding the world. We've got about 8 billion people on this planet. So, you know, how are we doing feeding what we've got, and more are coming? And then can we do a better job? And that leads us then, like optimizing a laptop computer, these things lead us into what is the optimum CO2 level in Earth's atmosphere. And I'm going to let you guys know right up front is that I have a very different view of the world than a lot of people do. I've spent most of my life at this point in the subarctic up in Alaska. And this is a picture of my house in Eagle River. And we had an old time Alaska winter this year. And it was cold. And it spent about a month and a half between about -5 and about +15. So what you're looking at here, this is the furnace outlet from, we got a furnace in our mechanical room down in the basement, and the water was condensing and running right here, and I've got a 10-foot tall ice stalagmite. So that it's just kind of a fun picture. This is sort of the world that I come from. So it slants everything that I'll show you. Okay, now I spent most of my career, if you can see my cursor, working in and around the Prudhoe Bay field up on the north coast of Alaska. And then the last few years, I've been working on this Novoportovskoye field in the Yamal Peninsula in western Siberia, which is also in the Arctic. And this slide also shows something kind of interesting. If you can see this dashed blue line, that is the average extent of the permanent ice pack. And the Gulf Stream comes up, and it comes up by England and Iceland and Norway, and it shoves this permanent pack ice way north. But that is not the case in Alaska. So you're going to be seeing some very interesting issues involving the ice pack and Point Barrow, which is the most northern point in Alaska. And basically, when we built equipment for the North Slope of Alaska, we had to sail it on these huge barges up through the Bering Sea, get into the Beaufort Sea, and then we had to try to clear the ice pack right there at Point Barrow. And if we get past Point Barrow, then we could race in and get our equipment to the Prudhoe Bay field. So I've been following ice for a very long time. This Novoportovskoye field that I've been working on the last few years, they don't have a pipeline for their oil. They have to deliver their oil by ice-breaking tanker around Norway to get to Western Europe. So this is just a cute tourist picture. It's a couple of years ago. I'm in the field up in the Russian Arctic, and I'm working for a company called Gazprom Neft, which is the Russian national gas company, and it's their oil arm. And this is the only time I've had my picture taken with my hands on a Russian oil wellhead. So this again is in April, and the Russian Arctic is every bit as crummy as the Alaskan Arctic. It's just brutally cold. So again, this is in mid-April. Now, the interesting thing about Novoportovskoye is it was discovered back in 1964. And it's a big field. It's one of the biggest fields in Russia. But they had no way to develop it because there was no way to get the oil to market. And then they built, this is the most macho ship I have ever seen. This is a nuclear-powered Russian icebreaker. I think it's the world's strongest icebreaker. And again, you got the nuclear sign on there. It's a nuke. And they built this beast, and then they sailed it in 2011. They sailed it into the Yamal Peninsula, down where the oil field was, or going to be, and sailed it back out. And they proved they could break the ice and deliver the cargoes of oil to Europe. And that was possible in 2011. Well, it wasn't possible in like the 1980s because the ice was just too thick. So they did this ice breaking in 2011. The field went on production in 2014, and I started working on it in 2016. And it's not just Russian ice that I've been interested in. It's the big equipment in Alaska on the North Slope is all delivered by these giant barges that are towed with these huge tugs. And we have to sail this stuff around Point Barrow to get to Prudhoe Bay. And this is one of the projects I worked on. This is millions and millions of pounds of compression equipment for our gas handling expansion project. So they sail these barges in, and they land these barges on the beach, and then they haul these modules off. And this is how they do it. All the heavy equipment comes on these giant crawlers, and it's the same kind of stuff that NASA uses to haul the space shuttle to the launch pad. Their top speed's about like 2 miles an hour, but they can haul millions and millions of pounds. And I like this particular project because this was my project. My name was on the project funding document. And if you look closely here, you can see a man. So that arrow right here, that's 2 meters. So this is a 5 million pound heat exchanger that came in on one of the sea lifts and landed on the beach and moved in a position by these trawlers. Now, the reason that I say all this stuff is because I've been watching the ice for a very long time. And I moved to Alaska back in 1982, and this is a picture of the annual ice coverage in the Arctic Ocean in millions of square kilometers, and it's got history from 1979 forward. So, for example, in 1982, that's this green curve here. That's when I first moved north. And then in 86, we had a huge central gas facility, $1.5 billion, that we were just hoping we could get past Point Barrow. And my job was to take the gas from this facility and use it for enhanced oil recovery. So I had my arms and legs and eyes and everything else crossed that we would actually be able to clear Barrow because it's not a given. Some years we didn't. But we got the equipment landed. It's always around the early September that we're able to make that passage through. And so that's what it looked like back in the early 80s when I first moved to Alaska. And then over the next 20 years, it started getting less and less and less ice coverage, especially in the summertime. And the lowest ice coverage ever recorded was in 2012, and that's this dashed red line right here. Well, what's really interesting, there were these predictions that the Arctic ice would be gone completely. But if you look at this dark blue line right here, that's as far as the data goes for the year 2020. So for the last 10 years, the ice is basically stabilized and it's not going anywhere. And the blue curve right here, that's the annual average for 2011 through 2019, so the decade of the 2010s. And the, let's see, this is, okay, and this light blue guy, okay, that's the average. So anyhow, what you can see is we're tracking, even right now, almost exactly along with the average for the last 10 years. So the ice coverage is stabilized, which I think is really good news because it's, you know, we don't want it to go away.
I'm going to ask a question, Pat. What about the volume of the ice coverage? I mean, you were talking about coverage. What about the volume of ice? I muted you accidentally.
This is a satellite measurement from space, so it can measure the coverage, but it can't measure the thickness. So that's a question that I really don't know if there's. This is floating ice. This isn't like ice in on Greenland or Antarctica. So this is in the ocean, but I don't know if there's been any significant changes in the height. Again, I don't think they can measure that from space, at least not on the ocean.
A related question then, since this is stabilized, is that Northwest Passage from Labrador, is that open? Is that going to remain closed now?
Well, if you've got the right technology, you can get through it, and that's what the Russians basically do. Not our Northwest Passage, but they access their Arctic with these big huge icebreakers. So.
But 10 years ago, we expected it to keep going. Your point is it's not continuing.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Okay. It was going to be gone completely by 2013, 2014.
Okay.
It's not happening.
Stabilized.
So
all right.
It's stabilized, which I think is good news. So, but it's stabilized at a level where you can do this kind of development in the Arctic that you just couldn't do back in the 80s. Okay, so this is an interesting picture. I am not in jail. I was not drinking. This is a a picture we took at the Seawater treatment plant. It's 3.5 miles offshore from Prudhoe Bay. And that's where we get the water to do the water flood of the Prudhoe Bay field. But it is prime polar bear habitat. So you can actually drive to this facility over this causeway, but there's no guarantee you're alone when you're out there. So before you get back in your truck, you step into this cage and make sure there's no bears in the area, because we are not on top of the food chain up there. So, and I love the thickness of these bars. They are solid. But anyhow, so how are the polar bears doing? Well, it turns out the polar bears are doing very, very well. And they've got the polar bear populations broken up into these different areas. SB here, that's southern Beaufort Sea, northern Beaufort. The Chukchi Sea between Russia and Alaska is in here. And so the populations are increasing in all these areas in green. There's only one that's been decreasing. And the populations of polar bears, they're at all-time record levels. So there are more bears now than apparently there ever have been, as far as we can tell. And it's actually getting to be a problem for the Inuit that are living up there, because they're worried about sending their kids to school. And this was an interesting study. This was done a couple of years ago, but there's a big population in the Chukchi Sea between Alaska and Russia, but they've actually been able to weigh a bunch of these guys, and they're bigger than they used to be. So they're eating better. And if you remember, you know, the polar bears were supposed to starve and die because they couldn't get ice. They didn't have ice to hunt seals. Well, what's actually going on is the base of the food chain in the Arctic is these little tiny microscopic things. They're phytoplankton and zooplankton. And the phytoplankton, they basically utilize sunshine to do photosynthesis, and they can, since there's been more ocean water available rather than under the ice, the population of the phytoplankton has gone up. They feed the little fish and the filter feeders. Those feed the bigger fish. The bigger fish feed the seals feed the polar bears. So the whole food chain from the bottom up has gotten healthier. So it's a kind of not what people were expecting, at least not what some people were expecting. So that's sort of the Arctic-centric view of the world. Now I want to take a look at the whole planet. And this is a site that I check out every month. And what we're showing here is the lower atmosphere, and that's about up to 15,000 feet. And they can measure the temperature of the atmosphere by basically measuring the microwave emissions from oxygen molecules. And they do this from space. There's a number of satellites that are built to do this. And every month they come out. The guy that does this is at the University of Alabama, Huntsville. And they come out with a, you know, what is the average temperature for the lower atmosphere Earth planet-wide? And what we're looking at here, this last measurement, I just got this a few days ago. So at the beginning of July, they could publish the June data. So the Earth's atmosphere has warmed up 0.43 degrees centigrade since about, well, since about, like, let's call that about 1987. So in, that's 30 years, the planet's atmosphere has gone up by 0.4 centigrade, which is about maybe 0.7 Fahrenheit. And if you compare that, this is where it gets really interesting, where you compare the actual readings. There's a number of different readings, but here's the 0.43 centigrade in mid-2020. And these are the climate models, the predictions of how that temperature has gone up. And it's becoming distressingly obvious that the CMIP climate models are seriously overestimating global warming. So it's, you know, that's a real concern, because if you're using these models and the average of the 102 models is the black line, if you're using those to do your public policy, but reality is half of that, we've got some issues here. And here's one where I'm getting away from the world and I'm going to you guys in Illinois. And this, I just ran across this data a few weeks ago. And it's from the same guy in Alabama. So you've got these the Corn Belt, U.S. Midwest Corn Belt, which, man, that is, well, here it is. Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Nebraska, the Dakotas, yada, yada. And the climate models, the CMI 5 and the CMI 6 models are seriously over predicting what's actually happening. And that's, again, kind of it's concerning. So I thought I'd dig into it a little deeper, and I'd go to these National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration observations. And I'm going to just show July in Alaska, because I know it's gotten a lot warmer because I've lived through it. So here is your average July temperature in Alaska when I moved there in '82. And, you know, last summer I was up there working in July, and that's the warmest summer we have ever had in Eagle River and statewide. So Alaska, the temperatures have gone up for July. And anybody want to guess what it did at Illinois? Well, here's the Illinois data. And what we're looking at here, it's a temperature record from 1895 to 2020. And basically, Illinois has been flat for 100 years. And you can see what happened during the Dust Bowl times. That was pretty rough. But basically, temperatures in the Midwest have been flat or very slowly rising, just like this graph shows, where the blue is really going up slowly. And I checked a number of the other states and a number of the other months, and this is actually pretty consistent data. So it's really interesting. Okay, so that's temperature. Now I want to get into something that I think is more important, more to the point, and that is carbon dioxide levels. And what we're looking at, this black line, that is the average carbon dioxide level in Earth's atmosphere. And that goes back to the Cambrian, like 550 million years ago. So we used to have thousands of parts per million, and it has been declining with some big spikes up and down, but it's been declining over the past 500 million years. And we are now in the lowest period of carbon dioxide that the Earth's ever seen. We live in a CO2 starved world. So we think it's normal for planet Earth because that's what we grew up with, but we are not in normal times for CO2. We are in seriously low CO2 environment. And there was an excellent article. It's the title of this article, Carbon Starvation in Glacial Trees Recovered from the La Brea Tar Pits, Southern California. And I've been to the tar pits in La Brea. It's really cool. You know, they're famous for trapping like mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and stuff like that. But they also trapped and beautifully preserved a lot of plant material. So what they were actually looking at is juniper trees. And these guys were beautifully preserved, and they were able to do all kinds of really cool science on this. But the bottom line is, again, looking at the last 600 million years of Earth's history, the proper perspective is obvious. We live in a carbon-starved world. CO2 levels on planet Earth for over 4 billion years have never been lower than they were during the last ice age, less than 20,000 years ago. So basically, in about 15,000 BC, we hit the lowest carbon dioxide level ever on planet Earth, ever in 4 billion years of Earth's history. So, and people just don't seem to be aware of that, but it's absolutely true. And going back to the impact of that, when these levels were low, it really did a job on plant life. And so here's the quote from the paper. Modern plants with the C3 photosynthetic pathway, and that's most everything we eat. That's all trees, all bushes, all shrubs, almost everything except for the succulents like cactus. But almost everything that we eat uses the C3 photosynthetic pathway. All trees do. Nuts, fruits, almost everything. The guys that use the C3 exhibit major reductions in photosynthesis by 50 to 75% and growth by 50 to 92% at glacial versus modern CO2. And this is key, and may fail to reproduce as a result of carbon limitations. So, and these stress responses are due to limited CO2. And it basically, that makes it harder for the plants to breathe to get their carbon dioxide, and they need a lot more water to survive. So this is kind of what the CO2 looked like, and this is by geologic age. So you're looking at parts per million, 0 to 8,000 on this axis, and you can see the kind of the range during the Cambrian and during the Pennsylvanian time. That was fascinating because apparently fungus at that point in time did not have the enzymes necessary to decompose cellulose. So the trees that had just invaded the land, they grew and fell and they didn't rot. So they grew and they fell and they grew and they fell and they grew and they fell. And it sucked huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of Earth's atmosphere. And that's where all the giant coal seams, like in Pennsylvania, that's actually what this age is named for. So these giant coal seams in Pennsylvania and England and other places were formed during this time where the CO2 levels really dropped. And then apparently the fungi figured out how to use this stuff, and they started rotting trees like crazy, and CO2 levels increased again. And then during the Ice Age times, basically we got to these low levels again. And this is the time of the glacial starvation right there. Now we're looking at a record during the Ice Age, and what I've got here is this is time from 0 to 400,000 years ago, and this is the parts per million of carbon dioxide, and you can see these Ice Age cycles, you know, about 300 below 200, about 300 drops below 200, and it does that several times, but the lowest point ever recorded on planet Earth is right there. That's at 15,000 BC. And basically, plants almost died. If we would have gone down to 150 parts per million, the plants would have become extinct. It would have killed them. So that would have been a mass extinction of all the trees, all the bushes and the shrubs, all the nuts, most of the grasses, almost anything that lives on land except for cactus on planet Earth would have gone extinct. And that would have obviously just done incredibly bad things to the animal life. Now here's another thing, and this is probably the least fun part of my talk, but this is real deal. And you know, the way I like to express this so people really get it is, it takes me 4 seconds to say this. Another child dies of starvation every 4 seconds. Another child dies of starvation every 4 seconds. Another child dies of starvation every 4 seconds. And this is real. And it's not just that kids are dying, it's that they're being horribly malnourished, and it's affecting their lives in very negative ways. And this problem is getting worse, not better. So what is the deal with CO2 and crop yields? Well, the basis for this plot, the pre-industrial concentration of carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million. And over the last 200 years, we started burning coal and oil and gas and stuff like that. And it's increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And what you're looking at is crop yields. So starting at a number 1, that's the crop yield for, let's just say, wheat or rice. And then as crop yields increase, or excuse me, as CO2 increases, the crop yields get better and better and better. And these are the ones that use the C3 photosynthetic pathway. And this is basically everything we eat except for corn. And interestingly enough, these are all the crops that use the C4 pathway: corn, millet, sorghum, sugarcane, and pineapple. And that's it. Everything else is C3. But this C4 stuff is much more resistant to low CO2 levels. It's much less efficient in terms of photosynthesis if there's enough CO2, but it's a lot more resistant to low CO2. And you know, with the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere going up, one would expect that the crop yields, and this is yields in terms of bushels per acre. So this is, you know, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and you probably can't read it, but that's 1988 to 2018. So that's 40 years of increasing wheat yields. That's bushels per acre. 40 years of increasing yields, soybeans. So, you know, some of this is due to better farming. A lot of it's due to increased CO2, and I have no idea what the split is between those two. And the real world results are consistent with the laboratory studies that I showed, like back here. And this is a really interesting plot, because what it shows is it shows crop yields, and these guys, the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology in the University of Kansas, they wanted to do actual lab experiments to see how bad was it during the last ice age. And so they got these plants, and they're all Latin names. I haven't got a clue what any of these guys are. I'm sure some of you guys are gardeners and probably know these things, but there's a bunch of plants. And we're sitting up here at like 400 parts per million CO2. I think when they did this study, it was maybe about 380. And anyhow, what you can see is as CO2 levels have dropped, the plant yields, the seed yield, the biomass that the plants can produce, drop big time. And this is as low, this is the 183 parts per million that we got to in the last ice age. And what you'll notice is it goes down to just over 150 parts per million. And there is no data at 150 parts per million because everything dies. So this is very real. I'm not making any of this up. And that's how close, this 30 parts per million is how close we came to mass extinction. So here's another plot. I like this plot because it's very simple. It's a little bit too simple, actually, but basically they are showing the yield of crops. And here we are at our 400 and a little bit parts per million. And if we keep going up to, like, say, 600 parts per million, we get these steep increases in crop yields. But eventually it turns around where you don't get anything. You know, your CO2 is plenty high enough. But if we go up a little bit more, we're going to have a lot more crops. And, you know, the other thing that they've developed in the last 10, 15 years, actually, no, they've developed it, they've gotten it better, but they've known how to do this since like about the late 70s. They can measure the light that is emitted by chlorophyll, and that's a certain frequency of green. That's why most plants are green. And they can measure that from space and determine how much green leaf coverage does the planet have? So what we did is we've been able to compare what it was like in 1982 versus what it was like when this paper was written in 2015. So that's about 33 years. And this was a big effort, 32 authors from 24 institutions in 8 countries. And they measured an increase in green leaf coverage on the planet that was equivalent to twice the area of the continental United States. And this was a great quote in the paper. As much as half of all vegetated land is greener today, and remarkably, only 4% has become browner. So this, and this is due to the rising levels of carbon dioxide. So it's not just crops, it's the wild plants too. And you know, I just wanted to throw this slide in there as basically a warning from the United Nations that this food thing is not getting better, it's getting worse. And so this is really kind of serious stuff, and this is pretty recent, like 21st April this year. So, you know, this whole thing of feeding the world and carbon dioxide's role in it it's a very big deal. So you look at the pros and the cons, you know, all the stuff that we've gone through, you know, there's potential costs, there's very real benefits. And how do you optimize? How do you come up with an optimum? And that's what I tried to show in this table here, because my point of view is we dodged this mass extinction bullet at 15,000 BC, where it would have been the worst mass extinction in the history of the planet. The world has become healthier and more livable as CO2 levels have gotten back to more normal, whereas we're getting out of the CO2 starvation mode and into something a little more normal. But even now, we need more, not less, carbon dioxide. And so here again are the carbon dioxide levels, and here's the impact on the Earth. Again, 150 ppm, that would be total disaster. At 200 parts per million, you know, agriculture didn't work. Agriculture did not appear on planet Earth until it hit 250 parts per million. And then agriculture popped up in North America, in South America, in Asia, in the Pacific, in Europe, in Africa. All over the world, agriculture started when it got to 250 parts per million, because you couldn't make a living at 200. You're basically limited to be a hunter-gatherer. And we're currently at about 400, and we've got a robust plant ecology where the Earth is greening, the crop yields are going up and up, and you know, we're able to do quite well at 400 parts per million. We could do even better at 600. So that's what I believe the optimum is. And at some point, you know, people say, well, CO2 can be toxic if it's too high. And the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I think that's what OSHA stands for. You can go to work for an 8-hour exposure as long as you're not above levels like 5,000 ppm. So 600 ppm is totally and completely medically safe. You don't want to live your life at 5,000 ppm, but you can certainly go to work for 8 hours and do that. So we need more, not less CO2. That's what I believe. I believe the data really supports that. But is there something we should do about climate change? And I think the answer is yes. And this is something we can actually do without starving kids, is we can reduce methane emissions. And methane is, it doesn't last forever in the atmosphere. It eventually oxidizes and it becomes CO2 and water vapor. But it takes a number of years. But like if you look at it over a 20-year time period, this global warming potential 20 years. And that's what the this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's their terminology for it. But a molecule of methane is 86 times more potent than a molecule of CO2 in terms of global warming. And even up over 100-year time frame, it's 34 times more efficient at trapping heat. So if we can reduce a little bit of methane, we can do a lot of good in terms of raising temperatures, of not raising temperatures. And then this is a pie chart that shows where does this methane come from. I like this term, enteritic fermentation. What that basically means is sheep, goats, cows, even camels, things that have the ruminants. They have multiple stomachs. They use a process that has methane releasing bacteria. That's how they dissolve all the grass, and they belch and sometimes fart a lot of methane. So that's basically sheep and cattle. Kind of hard to do something about that. Maybe if you don't eat red meat, you have less cattle. I like red meat. Here's something we can do something about. Landfills. There's a lot of rot that occurs in landfills, and you can actually capture the methane from these landfills and use it as fuel. I think we can do a lot better job in the oil industry at preventing leaks of methane. And we now have the technology to see this stuff from outer space. It's just been developed over the last couple of years. But we can spot these leaks, and we know where they're at, we can fix them. So this is something that I think we should actually do. And it doesn't hurt food crops. It doesn't, it doesn't starve people. And with that, basically, I'm done. I'll be happy to answer any questions.